Hello class. We're going to go over a recorded lecture here on the neural circuit that I'm going to use this digital whiteboard here to illustrate instead of doing it in person. All right, so today we're talking about the neural circuit. So in order to do that, first I'm going to show you a little bit of information about our example joint here. And I'm going to go over and show you a little bit of anatomy of the spinal cord, and then we're going to put them together. And so this is fairly basic, simple stuff here. You can get into more detail here on the mechanisms. But that'll take a little bit more background information than what we already have, and would take much longer. It could take a whole 2 hours just going over the details of this neural circuit, but we'll go over the basics right now. So I have an image here of the side of the knee. So right here we have the femur. Down here we have the tibia, and the fibula right here. And right here we have the patella, or the kneecap. In red, we have our two major muscles here that surround our femur. We have I'll do this in red. We have the hamstring, and we have the quadriceps. Oh, sorry, here we go. Quadriceps. Okay. And I guess we should point out the important ligaments and tendons here as well. In blue, we have our patellar ligament. And up here we have our quadricep tendon. Now, a little anatomy quiz. What is the difference between a tendon and a ligament? Ligaments attach bone to bone. Tendons attach bone to muscle, as you can see here. Now, when you go to the doctor, you may have had this stretch reflex test. And they take a little mallet. Oh my goodness. They take a little mallet and strike you right here on the patellar ligament. And what this does is that it pulls down on the patellar ligament, the quadricep tendon, and it stretches your quadricep ever so slightly. Now, the important thing to realize here is that throughout all of our muscles, we have what are known as sensory neurons. And among the different types of sensory neurons that we have throughout our body, we have stretch sensory neurons in our muscle. So these specialized neurons detect when the tissue that they innervate are stretched. And it's a pretty ingenious mechanism by which they do that. We're not going to get into the details here because we need to know a little bit more about how action potentials are caused. But essentially, we have in our neurons here little channels. And these channels let sodium into the cell. And these stretch channels open up when the membrane that they're embedded in experiences stretching. And so they're physically pulled open when they detect a stretch. And it allows sodium to flow into the neuron. And that begins, stimulates an action potential. And we'll get into the mechanism of that very soon. But right now, all you need to know is that there are sensory neurons that are activated when there is a stretch in the muscle. So they're stimulated or activated. Now we also have, and let me use a different color here. Why not green? We have, in addition to sensory neurons, we also have motor neurons, which I'll use as green, that innervate the muscles, as you might imagine. In order for a muscle to contract, it must receive signals from the motor neurons. They start the cascade of events that result in muscle contraction. And we have the same thing happening in the hamstring down here as well. Now, what happens when the doctor, or you can do this yourself as you're listening, cross your legs as you're sitting, and you can just take the edge of your hand and kind of smack right below your kneecap. It's a little bit better if you maybe have someone else do it, since you can anticipate it coming. But you should get a little bit of a kick reflex. Your leg kind of shoots forward, your foot shoots forward. And what's happening here is that the quadriceps are contracting and the hamstrings are remaining relaxed. And so when you do that, you extend your leg, the tibia and fibula extend. And because of the nature of what the muscles are doing to the leg, you can also categorize muscles into skeletal muscles into two major groups called flexors and extensors. And so the hamstring is an example of a of a flexor. And the quadriceps is a good example of an extensor. And you can easily remember that. You can think about flexing your muscles, flexing your bicep. You're bending your elbow, right? So you're bringing those two bones together, or actually those three bones. Your humerus, your radius and ulna, bringing them together. That's a flex. And an extensor, extending. So you're going to extend your leg by contracting the extensor, the quadriceps. So when you straighten your leg, the muscles on top of your leg, the quadriceps, are the ones that are flexing. When you bend your leg, bringing your tibia and your fibia up to the femur, right? You're flexing the flexor. Okay. Now, before we move on to the spinal cord, there are just two more terms that I want you to know. And I'll remind you of this when we talk about the spinal cord, and then, of course, bring these together. There's two general terms that we use for sensory neurons and motor neurons. Our sensory neurons we call afferent neurons, or afferent sensory neurons. And our motor neurons are our efferent neurons, or efferent motor neurons. And the easiest way that I remember this is thinking about the flow of information. Sensory neurons are bringing information from the environment into the body, right? So that flow in information is going from the muscles or other tissues, doesn't have to be muscles, throughout the body. So afferent is bringing information in. So that's sort of the first thing that happens. And afferent begins with an A. So think about it alphabetically. Afferent comes first before efferent. And that efferent looks like a little F there. There you go. And so the first thing that happens is information comes into the body through the afferent neurons, or afferent fibers. And then that gets processed usually in some way in the central nervous system. Sometimes that involves the brain, sometimes it doesn't involve the brain. And then there's a response, and information gets sent back out to the body via efferent neurons, or efferent fibers, as they're often called, when you're talking about multiple neurons together. So afferent happens first, information comes into the body, and then efferent is the next step in the process. The information going out of the body, telling the body how to respond to environmental stimuli. So in this case, the hammer on the patellar ligament is a stimulus from the environment. That information is transmitted through the stretching of the quadriceps, the stretching of those sensory neurons through the afferent fibers. A little bit of processing happens in the spinal cord, and then information flows back out through the efferent motor neurons to the quadriceps, telling the quadriceps to stretch. Okay, now let's move on to the spinal cord. Okay, so let's talk about the spinal cord, the other half of our neural circuit, and then we'll bring them together so you can see them together. And so this is a transverse section, or a cross section of the spinal cord. In this example, we would be located right around our lower back, the lumbar portion of our backbone, since we're talking about our quadriceps and hamstrings and our knee joint. And so a transverse section is if I were to be cut in half at my belly button from my stomach in through my back, so you would just have my legs, and then my upper torso detached from my body, and you were to look down and look at the spinal cord, this is what you would see. And this is just the spinal cord. We're not taking a look at any of the vertebrae here, so just the nervous tissue. So remember, the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, right? Not the peripheral. We don't get into the peripheral until you leave the spinal cord. And so a nervous tissue in the central nervous system can be broken up into, categorized into two major types of tissue. You're either gray matter, which I'm sure you've heard of before, or your white matter. And let me attempt to kind of color code this a little bit better. So we know. Let's see what this looks like. There we go. Of gray matter. All right, this is our gray matter right here. I'll draw that again, huh? Okay. And we'll switch back to black. And just so you don't forget, it's a little too skinny. Gray matter. Okay, excellent. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the different parts that we should know about. So as we describe the circuit, we can refer back to them. And so right here, this little section, right here, we have what is called the posterior gray horn. Posterior gray horn. And down here, I'm gonna guess, we have the anterior gray horn. Now, for those of you that have taken a class where you've gone over anatomical terms, you can think about where this is situated on the human body. Now, for those who haven't, you can pause it and try to remember if you don't already know. And for those of you who have not, I don't think you would have gone over this in cell bio, since you're just talking about cells. So posterior is behind, right? That prefix means after or behind. Anterior, anti means in front of or first. And so the posterior gray horn is closest to your back, and the anterior gray horn is closest to your front, to your abdomen, if we're talking about the lumbar vertebrae, which we are. So this is where these are located. And I should also talk about why gray matter is dark and why white matter is light in appearance. Some of you already know this from vertebrate physiology. So you can go ahead and pause it if you want and try to remember. But white matter is white because this is where we see a lot of myelination. So it is a myelin heavy portion of nervous tissue. Now think about our anatomy of the neuron. What parts of the neuron would this be? White matter has lots of myelin, which is a lipid-rich tissue. It's used to insulate neurons so that they can propagate their electrical signals faster and stronger. And of course, our myelination occurs around our axons. So white matter is where we have a lot of the axons of our neurons projecting. And the gray matter, therefore, is where we see lots of our cell bodies. Or somas. Soma. Okay. Now the posterior gray horn is where we get is where our sensory neurons come into. And they come in through what's known as the dorsal root. Just right here. And for each section, this is a bilateral structure. There's one on the left and one on the right. Right. This is our dorsal root, and this is also our dorsal root. And so we have sensory neurons that come in. And so let me color code here since we've got just a bunch of gray and black so far. And so our sensory neurons will come in through the dorsal root into the posterior gray horn, and they will make important connections. So these little forks at the end represent just the axon terminals. All right, so they're going to synapse onto, what do you think they synapse onto? You guessed right, I'm sure. Motor neurons. Now let me represent the flow of information here with some arrows. So information coming in on our afferent sensory neuron. And information flowing out on our efferent motor neuron. Efferent, because it comes after A. Okay. Now you might notice here that I drew a split. Oh, yes. Before we go on to that, you should know that this is called the ventral root. Ventral. Yes, T-R-A-L. And of course we have two of those as well on either side. You might notice here and make things just a little bit confusing. We've got ventral and dorsal, which in this particular situation, our spinal cord is synonymous with posterior and anterior. Dorsal and posterior are our back, and ventral and our anterior are our front or abdominal side. So we have something really cool that happens inside the spinal cord. Get another color here. We have the existence of things that are called, and I'm going to draw it all, label it all the way up here, interneurons. Interneurons. And so interneurons are neurons that are found in the central nervous system. And they do all of our kind of processing. So sensory neurons collect information from the environment. Interneurons process this information and send commands to motor neurons, or efferent neurons. And the efferent neurons are responsible for basically responses, motor responses. And they can be somatic in the body, or they can be they can be visceral, which are smooth muscles, like what's in your GI tract, cardiac muscle, your heart, or a number of different glands. Okay. So in these interneurons, right, giving information to motor neurons going out. Okay, so there's a little middle neuron, the middleman, so to speak. This gives us an opportunity to change the signal, change the sort of the meaning of the signal, which we'll take a look at when I bring both our joint and our spinal cord images together and go over the whole circuit.